Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Benjamin Ibarra. I'm a faculty member here at UT Austin, the School of Architecture, and I am the chair of the Historic Preservation Program. And I want to welcome everyone to today's Goldsmith talk presentation by Dr. Nick Webb, sponsored by the Historic Preservation Program. I met Nick about probably what was like 3 years ago when we shared some notes in a symposium that they organized at University of Liverpool, and I learned about the fascinating work they are doing. He and a number of researchers from University of Liverpool have been working on medieval vaults in England, looking at ribbed vaults and their geometry and so forth. And those of you who know a little bit about my work or my interest will understand why I have a connection with Nick. And I really admire his work and the work they are doing. And they recently organized a symposium that was held online, virtually. And I had the opportunity to see the presentation that Nick made during that symposium. And I was like, we have to have that presentation or something similar here for us. Especially because many of you attending the lecture today are interested on point clouds, 3D modeling, digital surveys. And I think that Nick's works is a clear example of how this type of information, this type of data can be utilized in the context, not only of reverse engineering of historic buildings, but also in the context of conservation, using those type of techniques or methods and technologies as a tool for the conservation of the built heritage or historic structures. So Dr. Nick Webb is an architect and a lecturer at the Liverpool School of Architecture. As a researcher, he is interested in how digital tools and techniques can be used as methods to enhance and critique our understanding of historic works of architecture, whether they be existing buildings, were built and then damaged or destroyed, or were not built at all. His research focuses on methods that enable new information to be provided that will not have been possible in a pre-digital context, including digital capture technologies such as laser scanning, three-dimensional digital modeling and analysis, and immersive virtual reality techniques. He's currently co-leading the Tracing the Past, Analyzing the Design and Construction of English Medieval Vaults Using Digital Techniques research project alongside Dr. Alex Buchanan. They have a website, by the way. I hope Nick shares the website. Otherwise, if you just type Tracing the Past and the title of this presentation, you actually will find the information. I highly recommend for those of you who are interested on this type of work to go to that website and see the fascinating work that Nick and his colleagues are doing. Anyway, so with that, I will pass the microphone to Nick and let him do his presentation. Thank you very much, Nick, for joining us all the way from Liverpool. Thank you.
Thanks, Benjamin. Just checking that you can see and hear me okay?
Yeah.
Great. Okay. So, yeah, thanks for the invitation. It's a real privilege to speak to you, particularly given Benjamin Ibarra's work, whose research into Central American vaults was a real inspiration to Alex and I. And I think based on Benjamin's introduction, you know who I am. But just to mention that I co-lead this project with Dr. Alex Buchanan, hence why I've very much put her name on the title of of the lecture as well. And Alex is a senior lecturer at the University of Liverpool over in the Department of History. So today I'm going to discuss some of our findings in relation to vaulting, and I'm going to base this on Exeter Cathedral. So I'll first give a broad overview of our project, followed by an outline of our digital methodology, and then I'll go into more details of how we use generative design tools to help us better understand the medieval vaults. And in this case, I'll talk, as I said, about Exeter Cathedral. So the collaboration between Alex and I into English medieval vaults began in 2014, and we received a number of small grants early on, and that included funding to survey Exeter Cathedral. And that also facilitated our first medieval vault symposium that Benjamin mentioned, at which he was a keynote speaker, I must add, and that was in 2016. And then a couple of years later, in 2018, we received a grant of nearly £250,000 from one of the big UK research institutions, and that allowed us to expand the project and include a lot more sites. Crucially as well, it enabled us to add Dr. James Hilton to the project team, and he had a lot of input in the production of the book, and Dr. Sarah Duffy, who I should say is a resident of Texas, and she led on the archiving of all of our digital data. Okay, so why we're looking at medieval vaults? Well, in 1841, Professor Robert Willis, who was a scholar at the University of Cambridge, he gave a lecture to, at that point, the newly established Royal Institute of British Architects, who are our kind of regulatory body. And at this talk, he outlined his theories on how vaults were designed and constructed. And he based his findings mainly on accessible vaults, such as cloisters, which are relatively low to ground level. And we can see that here. This is Norwich that I've highlighted at the bottom for you. So this is just 4 meters above ground level. So it was easy for Willis to access using a step ladder or equivalent. I've added people for scale here, by the way. However, the problem was that many of the vaults which Willis wanted to look at were a lot higher. For example, one of our primary case studies, the choir aisles of Wells Cathedral, they're about 8.5 meters above floor level at their apex. And the vaults I'll discuss with you today, this is the nave at Exeter, they're about 20 meters above floor level. And the highest we found in England in terms of the sites that we've studied is the Lantern at Ely, which is a whopping 44 meters above floor level. So many vaults were therefore inaccessible to Willis. And he used this talk in 1841 to the RIBA as a call for more data. So if architects were working on cathedrals or churches and needed to put up some scaffolding, he was asking architects, can they give him the data that he needed to further his research? However, he wasn't very successful at this. It was only Charles Barry who kind of gave him some information on it. We also need to think about the accuracy of this previous scholarship based on the fact that all information was collected using analog techniques. So flash forward 180 years, we still don't fully understand how medieval vaults were designed, but we now have digital surveying methods that allow us to capture these amazing architectural elements both quickly and accurately. So as I said, I'll talk today about the high vaults at Exeter, in particular the nave. The vaults are quite renowned for the fact that it's this very long avenue of tiercement vaulting. They extend the whole length of the nave, the choir, and the Lady Chapel. And these were built between 1275 and 1369, and this is evidenced by fabric rolls, so showing some of the construction processes and the finances, the records that are available. But before we go into our findings, I want to talk to you about how we decided on our methods to capture the data. So we explored 3 different methods that you can see here: total station, laser scanning, and photogrammetry. So I'll go through each of the 3 and talk through, from our perspective, what were some of the advantages and disadvantages of them. So starting with total station, just in case you don't know what that is, the way it works is you look through a lens and, guided by a laser, you pick out a point in space that you want to record, press the side of the total station, and it records that point as an XYZ coordinate. And you do this several times over to record the points that are required. And you get something like you see here in the top central image, which is a dot-to-dot plan of the vaults, in this case at Exeter Cathedral. We can really see this as well as a precursor to more advanced laser scanning. So what are the advantages of total station? Well, the data is precise and it's selected. So you're only recording what's required. But we can also see this as a disadvantage because you need separate campaigns to record all of the other elements. So for example, in the image you see here, we're recording all of the rib intratus lines, more on that later, but we'd have to run separate campaigns if we wanted to study the webbing in between. Another disadvantage, the scanning times are quite long. We found it takes typically between an hour or 2 hours to scan an individual vault bay, and it's also pretty backbreaking work. And finally, the scans aren't in color, so you're only recording individual points without color, and it's not a full 3D model. So at this stage, we abandoned total station. It wasn't quite right as our primary scanning method. That's not to say we won't revisit it. We've seen, for example, some very good work from some of our Spanish colleagues who have been investigating mortar joints and rib profiles using total station. So as I said, it's something we may come back to in future. So the second method that we looked at was laser scanning. And again, a quick overview. So the way a laser scanner works, it records the distance between it and every solid surface that it hits. And it does this hundreds of thousands of times over. It also takes a series of photos at the end of the scan cycle. Therefore, you can assign color to each of the points. And what we get at the end is a point cloud model. The way that we describe this to members of the public is being like a swarm of bees, but in the shape of a building's interior. So what are the advantages and disadvantages of this method? Well, an advantage is the fact that the data is precise and it records all the details of the vaults and the wider interiors. So for us, we're interested in the vaults above, but we're also recording window tracery, interior elevations, floors, etc. So it's all there should we decide to investigate that at a later date. And also importantly, given things like the fire at Notre Dame, we have this data for the cathedrals for future use. Another advantage is that laser scanning is relatively fast. The scans we use take between 10 and 30 minutes, depending on the height of the vaults above us. A disadvantage, we tend to end up with very large files, so you need a pretty decent computer to be able to do anything with that data. Further disadvantage, it is very expensive in terms of the hardware and the software involved. But once we have that data, we can export it as ortho photos. So that is ortho rectified images. So perspective has been removed, and you can see an example of that top center again at Chester. We also make use of mesh models where the point cloud is converted to a surface model. The third method that we investigated was photogrammetry. The way this works is you take hundreds of photos using a digital camera from as many different angles as possible to ensure all details of the target you are looking to capture are recorded. Here you can see JR, one of our technicians, working carefully in the quiet aisles at Wells Cathedral to capture all that data. If you look closely at his feet, that's the cathedral cat. That's the resident cat at Wells Cathedral, just checking that we're behaving. So once we've taken all of those photos, we import them into a piece of software. We use Agisoft Metashape, which is probably the market leader. And Agisoft then processes the images and figures out their position in three-dimensional space. And from this, we can create a point cloud model in the same way that we have point clouds from laser scan data. And again, we can export it as orthographic representations and mesh models. So advantages of photogrammetry, well, it's inexpensive, particularly in comparison to laser scanning. So all you need is a digital camera. Even a smartphone is often good enough. And a copy of the software, an educational license is about £500. Another advantage is we tend to get quite high quality images out of it, and I'll talk more through that in the coming slides. And likewise, you'll see in the coming slides that one of the disadvantages is that we have found issues with the quality of the mesh and the point cloud through photogrammetry. So just using the Lady Chapel at Exeter as an example of this study, looking in more detail now at the differences between photogrammetry and laser scanning. So you can see here, this is a laser scan plan of the Lady Chapel. And we were very confident with the geometry that was coming out of this. The image was satisfactory, a little bit grainy though. Likewise, with the photogrammetry version, we were very happy with the geometry coming out of that, and the image quality was far superior. Then we started to look at the details. So what if we want to study things like rib profiles? So in this case, what you can see is a comparison of cuts along columns. This was about 1 meter above floor level. You can see if we compare the laser scanner and the photogrammetry, and bear in mind here that scanner and the camera were able to be positioned quite close to the target, we're getting pretty consistent results here. So in both methods, we're very happy with the results. However, when we then start to look at what we're more interested in, and that is the vaulting above, and in the Lady Chapel, for this case, it was about 10 meters above us, we start to see a breakdown between the laser scan version and the photogrammetry version. Bear in mind that most of our scans are taken from the cathedral floor, so we're always, as I said, in this case, about 10 meters away. So what we found from the laser scan version, which you can see in the far left image, is it's recording that rib profile pretty well. But the photogrammetry version, we weren't pleased with that at all. So the quality of the data is much worse. So for us, therefore, the way forward was to use laser scanning across all of our sites. And here you can see this is, oh, press play on that one. This is the laser scanner in action at Lincoln Cathedral. So pretty simple, it's mounted on a tripod, let it do its thing. I basically have the important job of standing around and making sure no one trips over it. Important for health and safety, but also important because if anyone touches the scanner, you need to then start the process all over again. So once we've scanned the spaces required, we tend to use, by the way, 1 scan per bay. We find that sufficient for our research. We have to then register that data. So using the software, we use a Faro scanner. So we use the proprietary software, which is called Faro Scene. The scanner has got, the scanner software, sorry, has got that good now that it just does cloud-to-cloud registration. It can automatically align all of the different scans. We can sometimes help it by showing it particular pieces of geometry within the scan, or in the olden days, we'd use targets. But as I said, a lot of that isn't required these days. What's really important here is the fact that we're doing 1 scan per bay on average means that we get an overlap between those scans, so we ensure really good coverage. And at Exeter, we produced around 80 scans, and this gives you an indication of where they were located and the areas within the cathedral that we were focusing on, that being the high vaults. And here you can see some of those initial outputs. So we have at the top a sectional view all the way along the nave, the choir, and into the Lady Chapel. And then below we have a plan version of that. So besides the ortho photos, we also export mesh models, as you can see here. And as I said, these are triangulated surface models. So I'll just zoom in and I'll show you one of those triangulated surfaces to give you an idea of it. And this is really important for us. It forms the basis of the next step. Okay, so here's that next step. We've now got all of the data that we require. We need to think about what to do with it. So critically for us is something called the intrados line. This is the outermost edge of the stonework of a vault rib. And when the vaults were being constructed, these would have sat on timber centering. So the way it would have worked is you would create the design required in the timber centering, and then over the top of that, you rest the stonework. And when the mortar sets, you cross your fingers, pray to God, whatever works for you, knock it out and hope that the stonework above remains in place. So this position along the stonework, the intrados line, is really important because it tells us a lot about the geometry of the vaults. Here's an image, by the way. This is an example of centering. We gave a previous talk and someone wasn't quite sure what it was. So we thought this was a really handy image to show you after the fire. Because of potential structural problems, you can see how at Notre Dame and the flying buttresses where they put that back in. So it's quite beautiful. Okay, so we trace along all of these Entradas lines. We do it either manually or by taking automatic section cuts. We do this in Rhino 3D, a piece of 3D modeling software, which I imagine many of you use. And from that, we crucially have that 3D data of each traced line. We can also export wireframes from that, so we can see a plan view of the wireframe and a sectional view as well. So once we have that traced data, we also convert it to best fit arcs. I'll show more about that in the next slide. But this enables us again to see key pieces of geometry. So I'll just explain some of these key terms before we go any further. So first we have the impost line, and this is the point at which the springing point of a rib appears to rest. And it's usually the abacus of a capital in medieval vaults. So you can see that along the bottom here. We also have the springing point, you can see here, and this is the lowest level of a rib where it departs from the underlying supports, and that's almost always a fixed point. We then have the apex at the top, and this is the highest level of the rib, and it's usually covered by a boss. And because we can extend lines out using 3D modeling software, we can create a notional apex point and take measurements from that. Of course, we have the radius or radii of each rib, because sometimes we find more than one arc, an arc that has more than one center to it. And finally, probably the most difficult one to understand, we have the arc center point in relation to the impost line. So the arc itself has a center point, and it's critical for us to understand its position in relation to the impost line. So in continental Europe, most examples tend to sit somewhere on this line. We find that in many cases in English vaults, but we also see in English vaults that this point sometimes sits above or below that impost line. So I'll just finish this section with a quick video, just to summarize the process. These are the choir aisles at Exeter Cathedral, and this is an example of a manual trace. So here you can see manually going along the Entradas line of this rib. Just going to turn my light on, getting dark here in the UK. So tracing along that Entradas line. And you can see quite handily, I've already traced the rest for the purpose of this demonstration. So once we've got all of those lines traced, the next step is to create the best fit arcs. So here I'm just highlighting the points along those traced lines. Really important to do this because Rhino, it can't recognize the fact that this is a curvature. It looks like a perfect arc, but it isn't a perfect arc. It's kind of a series of lines that snake slightly. So to make it a perfect arc, we then use the circle fit points tool, and you can see that now we've created a circle. So this best fit circle, we now trim down to become a best fit arc. So we're trimming now below the impost line, and the next step is to trim at the apex. So you can see that happening now. And once we have that information, we can then start to export it into a data table. So I've highlighted the ribs that I want to know more about. I'm asking Rhino, what is the radius of this rib? It's about 3.5 meters. So we have all these data tables set up for all of our sites. And you can see here, I'm now adding the radius of this diagonal rib that we've traced. And now I go back into that data. I want to find the center point of that arc in relation to the impost. So here you can see this is an example where it's quite far below, so nearly 1 meter below the impost line. So we record that number, And then finally, we do the same thing, but with the apex height. So hopefully you get the idea from that. Okay, so before we analyze the vaults in detail, let's just have a quick look at the anatomy of vaults so we know what we're looking at. So a Gothic vault has two main elements, the ribs and the webs. The ribs that I've highlighted here form the basic skeleton of the vault, designed to a particular 2- and 3-dimensional pattern, and they usually mark changes in planes as well. The webs or surfaces of the vault were usually constructed from coarse masonry and plastered over, but luckily for us in this example at Exeter, they're an exception to the rule, and we can see the coarse masonry underneath. And if you could cut a section through a vault, as we see in the image, and this is the post-war reconstruction of the South Prior Aisle at Exeter, you'd be able to identify the different stages of its construction. So after the ribs and webs were erected, the pockets behind the bundles of ribs were filled in, and the whole structure was usually coated with a layer of concrete-like substance. And architectural historians have given ribs different names based on their location. So first, as you can see highlighted here, we have the wall ribs or longitudinal ribs, and these mark the junction with the wall and the transverse ribs, which span between the side walls. And this marks the division between bays. And as you can see here, a bay is a compartment of vaulting. Next, we have diagonal ribs, pretty self-explanatory. And we then have ridge ribs, which run along the crown of the vault, either in an east-west direction, which is the longitudinal ridge rib, or a north-south direction, which is the transverse ridge rib. We also have additional ribs, which spring from the corners of the bay and rise towards the ridges, and these are called tiercerons, or sometimes they're called intermediate ribs. At other sites, we also find shorter ribs, which are known as liurns, but we don't find those in the vault we're studying at Exeter. So now that we've highlighted different elements of vaults, as well as our methods of digitally capturing them, let's have a look at digital analysis tools, particularly generative design, to help us better understand them. So we believe from our research overall that medieval architects started to design a vault by creating a plan of the rib in 2 dimensions. This was laid out full scale on a flat plaster surface called a tracing floor, and very few of these survive. We know about 3 in England, and we were very lucky to be able to record one of the tracing floors using photogrammetry at Wells Cathedral. So thinking about how you would create these designs then, primarily using a straight edge and compass. And with this, you can create different patterns and proportions. And we find evidence of this from the vaults themselves, so process of reverse engineering, as well as surviving drawings, parchments, and tracing floors, as I've already mentioned. And the use of such tools suggests that 2D designs were achieved by dividing the plan of the bay with lines and arcs. And this also continues into 3 dimensions by projecting curves from the 2D plan, formed by a series of fixed parameters, usually influenced by the existing architecture. So hopefully what I'm starting to show you here is that medieval 2D and 3D processes therefore relied on rule-based geometry. And we can see rule-based geometry increasingly used in contemporary architectural design practice. So generative design software, for example, Grasshopper 3D, is used by architects today. For example, Zaha Hadid Architects. I think she's probably one of the most prominent users of this software, or the legacy in her practice that remains, they still use it. And rule-based or parametric architecture enables every element of the design to be connected, achieving, as Bert states in his book, a self-referential condition where you can make changes whilst preserving the overall concept. And given the rule-based nature of much of the geometry of medieval vaults and the availability of parametric design software today, we wanted to see if these tools could help us to better understand the medieval vaults. So let's start with the 2D plan. So we'll think about bay proportions first. And in many cases, the 2-dimensional plan defining the bay boundaries was designed to specific proportions, and these included root ratios, particularly what's known as the medieval golden section. You can see that here on the left, so this is 1 to root 2. We also see modular ratio systems, for example, 1 to 2, 2 to 3, 3 to 4, And as we can see on the far right here, we've got an example of this, which is 5 to 6. So as such, if the width of a bay is known, we can automatically determine its length when a specified ratio is used. And here we've now overlaid examples from some of our case study sites, which seem to correlate to particular proportions as outlined in the previous slide. So this is one of the bays we're looking at here. This is bay C15 of the nave at Exeter, which appears to be a 1/√3 rectangle. It's really important, though, to note that many vault bays in our research don't appear to be based on the proportioning system. And I think that's a cautionary tale for all of us working in this area of research. We need to really consider whether geometry such as bay proportions are meaningful or not. So then, starting to think about this in Grasshopper, we can set up rules for bay proportions. So if you use Grasshopper, you'll know this, but again, to outline to those who possibly don't know, Grasshopper uses visual scripting, and you use panels, you add these to the page, and you connect them together to create transformations under different parameters. And you can see a few examples of that here. So for example, for bay proportions, we add number sliders, and these are used to create a rectangular bay. And then we add further panels to allow the bay dimensions to be changed either freely, so we can make the bay any size, or to specific proportioning systems such as root rectangles, as I mentioned previously. We then add something called a stream filter panel. This is on the far right of the box. And the stream filter panel allows you to toggle between different proportioning systems, so they can be changed when required to observe and analyze their outputs. So once we've got the bay proportion, we can also consider the vault's design in plan. And at our sites of investigation, the star cut or variations of it often features as a basis of the plan. And the standard star cut, you can see an image of this on the right, is an effective tool for dividing the bay into fractions based on the intersections of crossing lines. So if we look at this image here, the way you create a star cut, all you need to do is bisect the 4 bounding lines using a ruler and compass, find the midpoint, then you create a corner to the opposite midpoint and back, and you do that in all 4 directions. And then using these different points, it allows you to break down that bay into various different fractions. So I'll show you a few examples of that here. So at our sites of investigation, we found thirds, for example, the choir at Lincoln. We found sixths, for example, the South Choir Aisle, well, all the choir aisles, in fact, at Wells Cathedral. We find ninths at the case I'm talking to you about now at Lincoln. We found fifths, at Exeter. We found fifths again at Lincoln. We found sevenths at Wells. And the largest number we found is 13ths at Ely. We still don't quite understand why we'd use 13ths as a dimension or a proportioning system, but that's what it appears to be based on our findings. And the high vaults at Exeter, as I've just outlined, they use the star cut to first divide the transverse direction of the bay in order to create thirds. And then we create a subsidiary star cut to create thirds of thirds or ninths. And we also do it in the other direction to create quarters. So the star cut basically gives us all the geometry that we need to create the plan of the bay. So the benefits of the star cut and designs such as this that were created from it is that it enabled a design to be transferred between bays using proportions rather than dimensions. And this is vital because medieval churches were rarely constructed to the same accuracy as our scans or modern buildings. So they had to be sufficiently flexible to account for minor variations between bays. So you can see that here, for example, in the choir, the size of the bays are very different to those in the nave. And even when we look at the nave, we can see bay 13 is about 5.5 meters. Then we get a run that are about 6.1 meters. And then as we approach the west front, it's a lot smaller still. So this is really critical for the medieval masons because they can still maintain the designs that they require using these proportioning systems. Okay, so in addition to the standard star cut, we also find the inner and outer circle star cut. So this is the second and third images across. And these help us to change the angles of the tiercerons. And we find these variations at many of our sites, but that's a talk for another day. Crucially, with all three versions of the star cut and all other vault designs, for example, those that you see on the right-hand side of the screen, we can change the size of the bounding bays, but we're preserving the overall concept of the designs. So if we just take, for example, we'll look at the far right image. So this has been set up using a series of proportions at wells. So if it's a square bay, this is what we get. If it's a rectangular bay, this is what we get. But the underlying philosophy, the concept remains the same. And here we can see this demonstrated in Grasshopper now for the high vault at Exeter Cathedral. So back to bay sizes, we can freely change the bay itself, and we can see that the design itself is maintained. I've now switched it to a root 2 rectangle, and now if I change the X coordinate, it's updating the Y coordinate to ensure that it maintains a root 2 rectangle. So let's now have a look at the design in 3 dimensions. So we've identified the use of many different methods to create rib curvatures in 3D. And in each of these methods, we work from the basic principle that the 3D form of the bolts of this period is dependent on 5 different factors, as demonstrated using the high volts at Exeter. So on the screen, you'll see we have the 2-dimensional pattern of the ribs that we've already highlighted. The next factor is the height at which the ribs spring. This is known as the impost. So I'm recapping a few of those points now that I mentioned earlier. We have the height of the apexes of the ribs. We also have the radius of the ribs and the position of the center of the arc of the rib in relation to the impost level. And each of these factors could be used as a starting point, which limits the options available for the others. And once you've got 4 out of 5 of those factors as being fixed, then the 5th one automatically follows. So again, this is another example of generative design. And also, some of these elements could be fixed by the pre-existing architecture. And the 3 main methods that we found in use at our sites of investigation are the chord method. This is where the unknown is the rib radius, which is therefore generated depending on the geometry of the other fixed elements. And this is common when you need a horizontal ridge line as part of your design, but it also results in varying radii between the different ribs. The central strip that you see here, this is showing the 3 circles method, where the unknown is the arc center in relation to the impost level. And this method can be used to maintain a consistent radius if required, and it also enables the bolts to maintain a specified apex. And finally, at the bottom, we find the 2 circles method, where the unknown is the apex height. And this can therefore result in bolts with a variety of apexes, whilst maintaining a consistent and/or specified radius, as well as having arc centers on the impost line. We also find a number of more complex methods, which we discuss in detail in our book, but we haven't really got time to go through that today. So here you can see those 3 main methods as scripted in Grasshopper. So I'll just show you a quick video of that. So this is the chord method. So you can see now if I try to adjust the radius, nothing's happening because that's the unknown element. Whereas if I adjust the apex height, you can see that that's updating the rest of the geometry, including the radius. Now I'm switching to the 3 circles method. So again, if I try and change the radius, in this case, that is changeable, but we can see that the arc center point is shifting up and down because we're changing that radius. And likewise, if we change the apex height, it's moving the arc center point up and down as well in relation to the impost. Finally, we have the 2 circles method. And again, we can change the radius, and that's raising or lowering the apex height whilst maintaining the arc center along the impost line. And we can see if we try and amend the apex, because it's the unknown element, nothing's going to happen. So that's just a quick video of those 3 methods. So we'll now look at how we'll now look at a Grasshopper model of the nave vaults at Exeter Cathedral in a bit more detail. And to explore this, we can make use of one of Professor Robert Willis's idea. Remember Willis, who I mentioned at the beginning of the talk. So Willis introduces the idea of a middle plan. And here a section is taken horizontally at approximately half the height of the vault. And the points along the intrados of each rib are connected to form a patterning plan. And here you can see Willis's example from Cloister at Norwich when he recorded those vaults. So here you can see the plan, the lines of each of the ribs coming out, and at about half the height, he records a little dot, and then he joins those points together, and that's what he's terming the middle plan. So here we can see the plan of 4 of the bays of the high vaults of the nave Exeter Cathedral, and I've also included here the middle plan as per the previous slide. And on the right, I've zoomed into a typical example from this run. It's important to note that from Bay 14 westwards, the middle plans have a distinct fluted appearance. So you can see this kind of fluted zigzaggy appearance. Hold that observation for now, we'll return to it. The design of the high vaults in plan at Exeter remain the same, as I've said, conceptually based on thirds and ninths to create multiple tiercerons, whilst the bay proportions change depending on the bay, which was demonstrated in one of the earlier Grasshopper videos. And our trace data suggests that all ribs had their arc centers on the impost, and the apex height was fixed, along with the springing point and the design in plan. So of those three-dimensional methods I outlined before, this is telling us that the radius is unknown, and therefore we need to use the chord method in order to complete each rib in 3 dimensions. So we select the chord method in the Grasshopper script, and then we can see what would happen if we make changes. So in the high vaults of the nave, there is some undulation for the transverse ridge rib, which in some cases needs to rise slightly to meet the apex of the longitudinal wall arcs surrounding the existing windows. And we can adjust these apexes somewhat dramatically, just to give you a demonstration in this case. And crucially, the underlying philosophy of the vaults is still remaining the same. So we can make these changes to the apex, but the design concept is still there. So at this point, we thought we had a good hypothesis for the geometric design of the nave vaults at Exeter. And you can see the left-hand image. This is the original trace lines of Bay 14 shown in red. And in the central image, this is our hypothesis exported directly from Grasshopper. And then on the right, we've overlaid the two. Again, suggesting a good match. But back to the middle plans that we described earlier. So shown in red at the top, we have traced the traced lines, which are derived directly from the original scan data, which show that distinct fluted design again. Well, if we look at the row below, and this is the Grasshopper hypothesis that we produced, it doesn't replicate the distinct form above, and is instead closer to semicircular as a middle plan. So this is telling us that there's something more complex at play in the design of those ribs. And to start to understand that, we can look at a mesh model of one of the bay corners of the nave. This is Bay 14. And it appears that ribs are being pushed forwards and backwards in an alternate plan. So the arrows that I've added here indicate ribs that appear to be pushed forwards. So you can see here, this seems to be forwards. The next one seems to go back and then forwards and back and forwards and back. It's much more prominent the closer you get to the springing. So you can really see them pushing forwards here. And we can also start to see this in our data. So the critical bit here is the right-hand column. So this is the average impost distance, the arc center in relation to the impost distance. So typically, if we saw this kind of data, we would assume that all arc centers are meant to be somewhere along the impost line. But actually what we're seeing is really subtle differences pushing the arc center either above or below. So if we work round a quarter plan, we can see we start with the arc center being below, then above, then below, and above, and below, and above, and below. So this backwards and forwards pattern that we get in 3 dimension is also being seen in an up and down pattern in the impost distance. And that again is because of the use of the chord method and the geometric principles of it. So Once we know this, we can then tell Grasshopper to update the information. So you can see here highlighted on the right, the distance from impost. And if we then adjust that, it will again automatically update in the wireframe model of the ribs on the left. So just pay attention to this area here and we'll show you with one of the diagonal ribs. So on the right, we're now moving the impost distance, and you can see on the left that that rib is being pushed either forwards or backwards accordingly. So once we've accounted for these minor design adjustments, we can see the updated middle plan at the bottom of the screen that's labeled as C. And this bears a much closer correlation to the fluted middle plans of the trace data at the top, shown in A. And looking at this in 3 dimension, the image on the left shows ribs springing from a tas de charge with all arc centers exactly on the impost level. So it's a very consistent conoid that we're getting there. But the central image illustrates the effect of making these minor adjustments with alternate ribs sitting backwards and forwards. And again, you can see that in the mesh model on the right-hand side. And this is critical really because it demonstrates that Grasshopper can be used to identify the subtleties of medieval vault design and allow us to quickly make changes to our hypotheses to replicate the fluted design of the ribs, in this case, in the nave at Exeter. Okay, so I'm nearly finished, but I'll just throw in a couple of more slides just to say we're doing other work with Grasshopper. This work here that you see was led by my colleague James Hilson. And here we were using normal vector mapping to better understand the changes in plane on the webbing, so the infill in between the ribs. So again, that's a talk for another day. Also, at some of our sites, as I've mentioned, we find this actually in the choir at Exeter Cathedral. We have ribs which have arcs of more than one center, so more than one radius is being used. So we've been using Grasshopper as well to try and identify the breaks between upper and lower arcs. So we tend to put it in a table in Grasshopper with 5% intervals, and we can see when radii stabilize, and that tells us what the best junction is between the two. Okay, so a few concluding remarks then. So Grasshopper aids our understanding of medieval design processes, particularly in establishing geometric rules, mimicking medieval design methods, as well as increasing modeling speeds, which is really important actually, because that gives us much more time to focus on analysis. In the nave at Exeter, parametric design helped us to explore and uncover very precise and subtle design decisions, notably the raising and lowering of arc center points in relation to the impost level to create fluted ribs. In Robert Willis's 1842 article, which followed his 1841 lecture, he stated that his research into medieval design processes should allow new vaults to be built using the original design methods of the medieval masons. So hopefully you'll see this in the images on the screen, that we too now, digitally at least, can use equivalent methods to create new bays of the Exeter high vaults to any design within the established medieval parameters that we found. Thank you very much for listening, and thank you very much to Exeter Cathedral for granting us access and the people for funding this research. If you want to read more about this, we wrote an article in the Journal of Architectural Computing. And if you want to read more about the project more generally, then we have a book co-authored by myself, Alex Buchanan and James Hilson, title of it there. And our website that Benjamin mentioned, the address for it is at the top of the screen. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Wonderful, wonderful presentation, Nick. Thank you very much. So we still have a few minutes for questions. So I'm opening the floor for anyone who would like to make a question.
I have one question, please. You were talking about the center point, and it changed. It could be due to inclination or to the height of the impost. Generally, is it more due to inclination or the height of the impost?
Sorry, what do you mean by inclination?
You could inclinate the circle. and you conserve the same radius, or you could just put it higher on or lower? And what is the most tricks used?
I think English volts, when compared to continental European volts, tend to produce a horizontal ridge line. So that means that you get less of a domical volt, as you see again in more European examples. So because of that, we tend to find more examples of the arc center point going either above or below, as opposed to being on it. It really depends on each site. You know, we find lots of different methods in play. Yeah, I don't think I could give a clear answer about which is most prominent, other than to say, you know, that the English method is slightly different.
Thanks.
Any other questions? Nick, I might use the opportunity to make a question. So we have, it is impressive the range of different radii that are used, you know, across the entire nave, right? And one of the hypotheses for the usage of ribs is that it will make it will standardize the creation or the carving of each one of the voussoirs of the ribs, right? Now, when you find that each one of the ribs has different or various radii, does that also imply that the carving of the ribs was adapted to each one of the radii, or is it that each one of the ribs voussoirs were adapted to these different curvatures that will be accommodating the geometry because of the base size and so forth?
Yeah, I think in each case, we haven't, particularly at Exeter, we haven't gone right down to individual voussoirs, but our understanding at this stage is that each of those voussoirs would need to be cut depending on that radii.
Wow.
So again, it's a funny method. We've only got one example that we can find in England so far. I'm sure there's more, and that's the southwest choir aisle at Wells Cathedral, which only uses one radii throughout.
Yeah.
But that's the only one, whereas all the other examples are using quite a few radii within them. And as you say, it makes it really difficult, because then if you're cutting the stone, it means that each one has to be done separately. And then I think, because, I mean, we're talking about the 14th century here, and I think obviously as you move forward in time, I think we probably started to realize a bit more that a single radii would be better. But I think that the point I made before is also really critical. The fact that in English volts, we tend to go for a horizontal ridge line.
Mm-hmm.
So that does really impact on the methods that you use and the type of tunnel that you want to create as well.
Yeah, absolutely. But I also think that it would be interesting as you move more into the voussoirs and carving to see if there are tolerances, right? I mean, in what extent 6.9 meter radius will change substantially the geometry of a voussoir if it's 7.10, it's 20 centimeters larger or 20 centimeters shorter. You know, that it is I'm just thinking about, you know, the overall construction site, right? And having the mason say, okay, this is, you know, the voussoirs for that rib that goes on this bay, but it wouldn't fit on the other bay, and if we just mix them, that would be kind of difficult. So it sounds, I mean, intriguing to me.
Yeah, it's interesting. Sorry, go on.
Using the same radius will be really economics for centering. So you could reach the ridge with just changing the inclination of centering, and now with changing the radius of the arch?
Yeah. Again, so yeah, sorry, I think I understand the previous question now that you asked. Yeah, so in terms of changing the inclination, we don't really see that, because again, we're seeing different radii, we're seeing distinctly different radii. So if you're changing the inclination, you're still stuck with the same radius. But in terms of what Benjamin said, I think it's interesting, because how do we deal with this when we get two radii that are very close together? Are they, is this something to do with our tolerances? Is it settlement over time? Where do we draw the line between one radius being different to another? And this is probably a cheap plug for our book and a couple of papers we've written as well. We try to discuss that in the book, to try and say, what is the difference between them? Where do we draw that line? So it's a difficult one, yeah.
Thank you.
Nick,
Yeah, Michael.
yeah. Oops. I didn't hear you say, but I get the impression that these subtle variations, these alternations among the ribs, is something that is too subtle to have been discovered by hand, by conventional measurement.
I would say to the,
go ahead.
I would say to the untrained eye, and I would include myself as the untrained eye, it's very hard to spot. It's only when you start to investigate it and see that there's something not quite right with standard methods that you then have to kind of have a closer look at it.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, we found with a lot of our research, we were, before we started the digital process, we'd be looking at scholarship that already existed, and people would say, well, we think there's a two-centered arch here or whatever. And in most cases, we found what previous people said to be true, but also we found contradictions to their work. But again, that's a talk for another day, I think.
Well, thank you.
Perhaps the last question, which is perhaps more in general, about the use of this technology in the context of building conservation, historic preservation. I think it's twofold. One, have you had any requests from professionals who are looking at the conservation of these buildings that you guys have been studying, use your data for conservation purposes? Or, do you see this data that you guys and investigations that you are creating making an impact on future decisions for the conservation of these structures?
Yeah, we've already had a couple of requests coming through, particularly from architects and archaeologists at our sites of investigation. So that's been really good to see. In terms of an impact, it's a difficult one, isn't it? Because it's the impact we don't want to have, for example, what we saw at Notre Dame. So I think it's good that we have a record of these buildings should anything happen, but hopefully they won't need to be used. I mean, I think changes over time, it's interesting. If there's movement, we can use this data to track movement. We can use it as we've done in our research to study various elements. But yeah, I think the one that we don't want to happen, although it is important, is for a building to fall down, and this is all we have left.
Wonderful. Well, thank you very much, Nick. I think that we are going to close today's Goldsmith Talk session. Thank you very much for this wonderful presentation. As Nick mentioned, there is a book, the website, articles. For those of you who want to dig deeper into this research, definitely recommend the book. I was fortunate enough to get a copy from Nick and the research group. So I'm really enjoying it. So I really recommend it. So thank you very much again for this wonderful presentation. Thanks everyone who is around, who is seeing it in the presentation right now, or who will be seeing it in the future as it will be recorded in YouTube. Thank you again. And yeah, I think that's it.